The first festival I went to was in 1972 to the Nancy International Theatre Festival. And I did Education of the Girlchild, the solo. And then I did a second part that I called Raw Recital. It was a duet where I was singing my music for organ and voice, and Ping Chong was doing movement, because he had come with me, for that tour. So, yeah, 72 was the first time, and it was Jacques Lang was the person that brought me. So I had just finished my very large work, Vessel, which had like 60 people in it. But I think the main cast was maybe 12 or 13. And I remember that we did a special performance for Jacques Lang and Françoise Kirilski. This is my other loft of Vessel Part 1, and we were hoping to bring that big piece, but it was pretty late. It was like maybe March, and I think the festival was June. And that was a very hard piece to, you had to get like 100 people for the outdoor part of it, and it was a big production. So we just did that small production for that festival, and then I went on to Liverpool, where we did Vessel, the entire piece, at a place called the Blackie in Liverpool. But that was not a festival, it was just that they brought us. But that was the first time I was in Europe, so it was very special. And then Festival d'Automne, originally we were going to bring Girlchild. There was some kind of, I don't know if it was a financial limitation in 1974. So we made a kind of 2-year agreement that I would come in 74, and I did Our Lady of Late, which was a solo music piece with a wine glass and the voice. And then we did Paris, which was a duet with Ping, and again, I think I called it Anthology, which was piano and vocal pieces. And we did it in a museum called the Musée Galliera, which was in the 7e. And then the next year in 75, we did Education of the Girlchild after we had been in Venice. But Venice was, Venice was really important to me, because I feel like nobody really knew my work that well. In Italy, I'd just done one little concert at the Salvatore Alla Gallery in Milano in 74. So in a way, we were unknown. And then Luca Ronconi came to the opening night of Education of the Girlchild, and he was in tears. And they even asked us to come and stay an extra week, which that was the first time that had really happened to me. So I always feel like the Italians understood my work. They understood the emotional quality, they understood the skills. And so in between that time where he had asked us to come back, we had a week free, and we played in Torino, the Piccolo Teatro. And then went back to Venice and did the second week of Education of the Girlchild. But it meant, having that someone really understand my work and see it and give me that kind of support really meant a lot to me in that time. I'll never forget it. So it kind of changed my life, really, in a way.
Did you also have the occasion to do some workshops while in Venice?
Yes, I remember it. I think even recently somebody that was in that workshop came to a performance when I was in Italy. They were in that workshop, and there's wonderful photographs. Have you seen that of all these? It's like, I don't know, 60 people or something like that. I have on my overalls. Yes, I remember it very well. Mm-hmm. And that was in a church. See, where we played Education of the Girlchild and Quarry was was in Geodeca. Yeah, and it was the Cantiere Navali. But where the workshops was over near, it was near San Marco, and it was also a beautiful church, that were open space, and I think that's where the Living Theatre was performing in 1975. And they did a wonderful piece, which I can't remember the name of, but it was wonderful. Also, I got to see Luca's work. I can't remember the name of it. Had these automobiles that went across the space. It wasn't his first big piece. It was a wonderful piece. It was like a highway. You sat on one side, and I just remember these. They weren't real automobiles, but they were like theatrical automobiles. I just remember the whole piece almost being like a scroll or something like that. I actually have worked very much in what is now called site-specific performance since the early days. And I wouldn't say I have a favorite configuration because I think every space has something different to say. So what I feel is, the way that I work is I go into a space and I prefer, concerts I'm fine in any kind of theater, but when I'm doing a large work, I prefer a non-theatrical space. So what I do is I go into a space and listen to what the space wants. It's like a dialogue. So it's very different kinds of configurations. Like the latest work that I did called Indra's Net, we premiered it at the Holland Festival in 2023 in this round, beautiful, huge round space that's called the gashouden, which is the gas, I don't know what gouden is, maybe storage. It was, where they stored gas. So it was a gigantic space, and they do rock and roll concerts and everything there. So that was so intriguing for me because I was working on Indra's Net for 10 years up to that point. And something about the round space felt very right. And so that's how so the audience was on, kind of curved around. The orchestra was on the other part of the circle. The chorus was kind of around the edge of it, and then the whole thing. And there was also a lot of film that was, projected from above on the floor. So I always like an audience looking down because I always like the floor as a surface, kind of a surface rather than looking up at a frame. I like the audience to feel like they're part of it. And then last fall, I did the New York version of it at the Park Avenue Armory, which is a gigantic rectangular space, but I still use the circular configuration, yeah. Another festival that was very important to me, over the years, so there's these kind of markers in my mind. So one is obviously Nancy, and one is the Biennale. And the Festival d'Automne, at that time, I feel like, I think the Italian audience was more harmonious with my work than the French audience at that time. Now the French have definitely caught up. But at that time, there was a lot, it was quiet work for them. It's very quiet, Girlchild. It's very meditative, and I think that they were used to something different, a little more flashy. But another festival that was very important to me was in 1978 was the Musica Nova Festival in Bremen, Germany. And that was a music concert. And again, I felt like the German audience really understood what I was doing musically. And that marked the beginning of a long relationship that I have with audiences, but also my record label, ECM, which is a German label. So, they have that vocal, of course Italy has that amazing vocal tradition, but the German tradition is also very interesting, because I felt like they understood how difficult technically our work was, but at the same time they got the poetic quality of it. So that was a very, there were a lot of openings in Europe that, changed my life, I would say. I always love being in Europe, I feel comfortable. We did the Musica Nova in Bremen, and then I think the following fall we did the National Gallery. There was a festival called Meta Music Festival. And then soon after that I started recording with ECM, and that also was another thing that changed my life. So, I'm very grateful. Well, I remember at the Biennale in '75, I knew the people from the Living Theater. I knew some of them for years. And I had seen some pieces in New York, but there was something about, and I don't know what the name of the piece was. It was very beautiful. It was a very simple piece where they repeated, they sung one line over and over again, almost the whole piece, but it became this cumulative thing where, you became part of the audience that wanted to sing as well. It was very simple. I always loved their pieces that were very simple. And I always loved Julian and Judith Molina, but I didn't know them well. But that they were colleagues, and that was nice. And I also remember that summer that somebody took us out on a boat to see a little Grotowski piece in the island. And we had read about him in New York, but we had never seen him. And yet there was a man, one of the actors that was teaching in NYU around that time, that always told his students at NYU to come to my concerts and hear what I was doing with my voice. So there was, again, it was a wonderful time of community at that time. There was, in the theater community in New York, there was a bunch of experimental theaters, and we can talk about that. But my colleagues, I really felt were like Richard Foreman, Bob Wilson, Bread and Puppet Theater. There was beautiful work, and we were like a community. I'm not hanging out, but just knowing that these other people were working was a wonderful thing. Now the bunch was kind of, it was sort of an experiment to put these directors together, like almost as a cooperative. And it didn't last for too many years. It lasted maybe 2 years or something like that. And I didn't participate too much in it. The summer of 1975, they went up to Connecticut College to what was at that time called the American Dance Festival. And they were doing like a summer in residency there. And I was working on Quarry, and I just didn't want something to get in the way of my concentration, so I didn't go with them. I think they went back as a group in maybe the year afterwards or something like that, or the year before. I think maybe I went up there in relation to the bunch of experimental theaters, and we did Education of the Girlchild, and we did Paris Chaconne. And then the following summer in 1975, they were going back up there again, and I realized, I really just needed to stay very focused on working on Quarry. So those directors was Andre Gregory, Richard Schechner, Richard Foreman, Charles Ludlam, who was, the two of us were very close friends, me and Lee Brewer. It was, I guess, just thinking about if you put people together in, that we would survive better, I guess. There wasn't a lot of collaboration or sort of exchange. But I guess it was just more this idea of, that people, it wasn't easy to survive in those days. I was on the unemployment line. Money was not happening, in those days, and it still isn't. It was hard to live. We didn't have money, but this whole area of New York, it really was geographic, because it was, below 14th Street community, you could say. And, I was thinking about, there was an artist-run restaurant that you probably read about called Food, where you could get soup and bread, and, it was pretty rich in terms of, there was a sense that we were in a community, even if we didn't hang out with each other all the time, but there was that sense and interest in each other's work, and there were many more people than I'm mentioning. I'm thinking about someone like Jack Smith. His work was great, and let me see, I'm trying to think who else at that period. It was, and music and dance, and everybody. Now, the decade before the 60s, when I first came to New York, there was an even more tight-knit community of really downtown artists that were coming a lot from the visual arts world, visual arts, music, theater, dance, and there was a lot of cross-fertilization of visual artists making very interesting dance pieces and dancers making plays, and there was a kind of very, very much people trying to push past the boundaries of their art forms. And I had already been working that way when I was in school, just as my whole mode of working already was trying to weave together these different perceptual modes. So when I came to New York and other people were kind of thinking in those terms, that was very helpful for me. It was very affirmative for me, because I had just glimpsed this myself as this student, at Sarah Lawrence College, and I was making pieces that had voice and movement and images and, light and objects. And then, it's great to come to New York and then be affirmed in that search to find, what's a way of weaving together our perceptual modes as human beings, as performers, but also as audience members, as a, kind of counterbalance to the fragmentation and also the specialization that was set up by the Western European tradition. Singers only sing, dancers only dance, all that. So that was it was a very rich time. I also realized that it was that it really had a social aspect, which had to do with knowing that our culture was maybe the only one that separated these elements. You know, like an African singer, drummer, and dancer and storyteller, you know, can be in the same body. Whereas, you know, in the Western European tradition, they were saying, how can you be a person that, you know, does all these things? So I was like, well, actually, I think of them as one thing. You know, it doesn't mean that I have to work harder to do all those elements and make them really high level, but in my mind and my heart, it's one entity.
How do you think this sense of community influenced the work of single artists?
I feel like my path, and I don't know about the other people in that time, although seeing Richard Foreman's work again, you know, I feel like I was just staying on my own path, you know, to keep the integrity of my vision. And it's obvious, and I wanted to make my own world and my own language, my own theater language, my own vocal language, my own perceptual language. And if you see Richard's work, you know, his world is very clear. So I don't feel like I was basically influenced, you know, in a very overt way, but one could say that in a time, you know, ideas are in the air. People are, you know, I always think artists are like, you know, they have antennae out, you know, and so of course, beep, 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 you know, they're getting the signals coming in from the world, and you know, they're responding to the world that they're living in, and they're getting the signals the ideas are kind of floating in the air. So, you know, you could say that's an indirect kind of influence. You know, I think really good art is always a kind of response to the world that that an artist is living in, even if it's not overt. You know, even if it's not overtly political or something like that. But of course, you're responding to the energy of what's going on. So I don't remember like particular, you know, like the cross fertilization of, you know, I don't remember that so much because I just feel like I was a person that had blinders on a little bit, you know, like a horse in a race, like I'm just like going on my own little path. Well, what was interesting in '72 was that I think I was the only person that wasn't doing political theater. And Ping and I were very surprised that, you know, like everybody's doing this kind of, you know, real, you know, there was a Montreal group and, you know, just political theater. And Education of the Girlchild is a very different, you know, the solo is, it's again, very meditative, very you know, it's really more like poetry. And I remember Jacques Lang was moved by that. I mean, I was really happy that he brought me, and he was very moved by that. So in a way, we felt a little isolated there, you know, that first time. Not so much at the Biennale, I felt, because I think there were lots of different things going on there. You know, that 1975, I can't remember who else, but I do remember certainly seeing Luca's work. And I'll tell you one thing that always surprised me about Europe that was very also different than the United States at that time was that what I always loved about being in Europe, like for example in Paris, the first time that in the Festival d'Automne when I did Our Lady of Light, there was a dance critic, a theater critic, a music critic, and a regular kind of art critic that all came, and they all wrote in the same magazine, and they all became friends of mine. And you never made friends with writers in those days because everybody would go, oh, well, then the person's going to be biased. But that was not what it was about at all. You know, when I made friends with those people, it was because we all loved art. And if they saw a piece of mine and they didn't like it or criticized it, that would be fine with me, you know, because I respect those people, and that you learn from that kind of writing. But in the United States, it was always like, oh, you never say anything to a critic, you know, because then you're, you know, it was so weird, you know. And I feel like in Europe, there was always the tradition of the arts community, writers, performers, you know, people who made things. That was part of the tradition. You know, you were in the same community, and it didn't matter, you know, because a good friend can also tell you the truth. You want it, you want the truth. So that was very different between Europe and America at that time. I think it's loosened up a little bit more in America now. It's not so like, you know, I mean, you know, it's just more human. Because look, art is just this, it's a healing element in the world, and we all love it. And so we have that in common, so why not? And there's a lot of people that don't love it and don't understand it and want it finished. So, as in what's going on in this country right now. The freedom of the imagination is threatening. For me, it feels nice to pass on this information so younger people can, feel the life of it, and maybe give them more support of their work to find things. Because, another thing, another sensibility, because I have a younger assistant who's a composer, another composer, Joe, you haven't met him, but, I think our time coming up was a time where it was really originality and exploration and really finding something new was something that was really valued. Uniqueness, originality, and in a way being radical. And people his generation, they don't want to be radical. They just want to make things, but maybe within, these limitations of this certain way of thinking about things. And you can't judge that, but I feel sad about that. Because it's much more conventional, conservative or something like that. And so, and what I would like is, I want to say that young people break through to something new. That's what I'm hoping for.